So hello everybody and welcome to the 7 ReCap webinar. Today's webinar is entitled How Can Democracy Survive Capitalism? Our speaker is Robert Reich. Robert is a professor of public policy at the Goldman School of Public Policy at the University of California, Berkeley, and a senior fellow at the Bloom Center for Developing Economies. He has served in 3 national administrations, including as Secretary of Labor under President Bill Clinton. He has written 18 books, including The System, The Common Good, Saving Capitalism, Aftershock, Supercapitalism, and The Work of Nations. He is co-creator of the 2017 Netflix original documentary Saving Capitalism and the award-winning 2013 film Inequality for All. He is co-founder of Inequality Media, co-founder of the Economic Policy Institute, and co-founding editor of the American Prospect. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. In 2003, Robert was awarded the Václav Havel Vision Foundation Prize for his pioneering work in economic and social thought. In 2008, Time magazine named him one of the 10 most successful cabinet secretaries of the century. Robert today will tell us about power, as power is the key to decrypting and understanding the current economic, political, and social system. Power and wealth have become the same. Great wealth flows from great power. Great power depends on great wealth. And power is the capacity to set the public agenda and influence legislators. And power is exercised through institutions. Today, the great political divide is between oligarchy and democracy. Over the last 40 years, a treble institutional shift has led to this divide. First, the change from stakeholder to shareholder capitalism. Second, the weakening in antitrust regulation and associated shift in power from labor unions to corporate monopolies. And third, financial deregulation. Understanding these dynamics and promoting active citizenship are necessary steps towards economic, political, and societal healing to revitalize democracy and restore a more just and fair society. Robert, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. My thanks to Dr. Morana Claudio and the Center for European Studies at the University of Milano Bicocca and of the Rimini Center for Economic Analysis, Europe, ETS. My thanks for all of you for inviting me to participate in this series of webinars on how to reform capitalism in order to make it sustainable, along with its human, social, economic, environmental, and political dimensions. I've chosen today to talk about how and whether democracy can survive capitalism. It's a large topic. I teach courses on this. This will have to be a much more truncated version of what I normally teach, and I'd like to focus on what is happening in the United States primarily, with implications elsewhere in the world. I'll speak for around, I'm certainly no more than 40 minutes, and then take any questions you may have. The central point that I want to emphasize is that capitalism and democracy are compatible, but only if democracy is in the driver's seat, if democracy is primary. If capitalism takes over democracy, then there is not much compatibility. In fact, democracy is seriously endangered, as is capitalism. If you look today, even what's happening with regard to the United States foreign policy, you see that the United States presents itself as the beacon of democracy, as it has for years, but now very much in contrast to the autocracies of China and Russia. The narrative that the United States is presenting to the world is it is American democracy versus China or Chinese and Russian autocracies. The reality is that American democracy is in danger of succumbing to the same sort of shall we say, oligarchic economics and racist nationalism that thrive in both Russia and China. After all, let's be very clear and honest about this. It wasn't long ago that Donald Trump, who openly admired Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin, encouraged racist nationalism in America. In fact, Donald Trump's campaign of 2016 and much of what he tried to do culturally and sociologically, and indeed the major thrust of his politics in terms of his base, was racist nationalism. And he delivered at the same time, and this is the critical point, he delivered much of the United States government into the hands of America's super rich. And he did it with a giant tax cut, totaling in American dollars about $1.9 trillion over a 10-year period. And also rollbacks, repeals of health and safety and environmental regulations, which America's oligarchy, that is the super rich in America, very much wanted. That duality, appealing on the one hand to racist nationalism in order to maintain and expand his political base, while appealing to the financial needs of the oligarchy in terms of his funding, was a strategy that to me exemplifies not only in the United States, but elsewhere around the world and historically, one of the most serious threats to democracy. And right now in the United States, we have state-level Republicans who are busily suppressing the votes of people of color. And they're also paving the way for a possible anti-democratic, small d, coup in 2024, because those states are allowing Republican state legislatures to take over electoral machinery. And at the same time, at the national level, the National Republican Party is excusing the attack on the Capitol, that is the January 6th attack, calling it, the Republican National Committee, calling it legitimate public or political discourse, legitimate political discourse. And at the same time censoring Representatives Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger, who are the only two congressional Republicans serving on the panel investigating the January 6th attack. Now, meanwhile, at exactly the same time, and this is all the legacy of Trumpism, meanwhile, at the same time, this huge tsunami of money now flowing from corporations into American politics is larger than ever. And this money, bankrolling almost all politicians to some extent in the United States, and financing attacks on their opponents, is undermining American democracy. In fact, undermining American democracy to some extent almost as much as did the 147 members of Congress who essentially decided not to vote for the popular vote last January 6th, but support Donald Trump instead. This is not limited to the Republican Party in the United States. The Democratic Senator Kyrsten Sinema, whose vocal opposition to change or to any change, really, in the filibuster, has essentially, at least for now, doomed voting rights in America. She received almost $2 million in campaign donations last year, even though she's not up for re-election until 2024. Most of these campaign donations came from corporate donors outside her state of Arizona, some of whom have a history of donating largely to Republicans. Did the money influence Kirsten Sinema? Well, I obviously can't say, but you should decide. I mean, besides her opposition to voting rights, she voted down a $15 minimum wage increase. She opposed tax increases on corporations and the wealthy. She stalled drug price reform, pharmaceutical reform. Now, these were policies supported by a majority of Democratic senators as well as a majority of people in her own state. Over the last 4 decades in the United States, corporate spending through political action committees on congressional elections has more than quadrupled, and that's adjusted for inflation. Labor unions in America used to provide something of a counterweight. For every dollar provided by big corporations, labor unions provided something in the order of 80 cents to a dollar 30 years ago, a dollar to a dollar 40 years ago. But now corporations are outspending labor in American politics by more than 3 to 1. There is no longer any countervailing power in terms of financing elections. What does all this mean? Well, according to a landmark study published in 2014 by the Princeton professor Martin Gilens and Northwestern professor Benjamin Page, the preferences of the typical American have no influence at all on legislation emerging from Congress. Gilens and Page, you may be familiar with their study. They analyzed 1,799 policy issues in detail, determining the relative influence of economic elites, business groups, mass-based interest groups, and average citizens. What was their conclusion? Gilens and Page concluded that, quote, the preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact upon public policy, unquote. Their findings were that lawmakers mainly listened to the policy demands of big corporations and wealthy individuals. That is, those with the most lobbying prowess and the deepest pockets to bankroll campaigns and to promote their views. That study, again, was done years ago. That was 2014. It's probably far worse now. Gilens and Page's data came from the period 1981 to 2002. That was before the United States Supreme Court opened the floodgates to big money in politics in the Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission case. This was before super PACs, the super political action committees. This is before dark money. That is the money that can be contributed to campaigns under the radar without knowing who is behind that money. This was all before the bailout of Wall Street. In other words, Gilens and Page's conclusions about the importance of corporate and wealthy money in American politics drowning out the voices of average Americans occurred. Those conclusions were based on data from even before the big money came into American politics. The corporate return on this mountain of money has been significant. Over the last 40 years, with increasing amounts, let's say, the corporate tax rates have plunged. 40 years ago, corporations accounted for roughly 20 to 30% of all government revenue. Today, corporations in the United States account for 8 to 12% of government revenue. Meanwhile, regulatory protections for consumers, workers, and the environment have been defanged. Anti-monopoly laws, antitrust has become so ineffectual that many big corporations now face little or no competition. Corporations have fought off safety nets and public investments that are common in other advanced nations. Most recently, President Biden's Build Back Better initiative. They've attacked labor laws, reducing the portion of private sector workers belonging to a union from over a third 40 years ago to 6% now. They've collected hundreds of billions of dollars in federal subsidies, in bailouts, loan guarantees, and sole source contracts. Corporate, we might call it corporate welfare, for big pharma, for the big pharmaceutical companies, for big oil and gas, for the 5 largest high-tech companies, for the biggest corporate agricultural companies, the largest military contractors, and the 5 biggest Wall Street banks. Well, all of that corporate welfare now dwarfs the welfare that actually average people get together. The combined welfare, public assistance. Public assistance, in other words, going to corporations is greater than public assistance going to individuals. The profits of large corporations based in the United States just reached a 70-year high, and that's even during the pandemic. The ratio of CEO compensation in large companies to the compensation of average workers in the United States had been 20 to 1 in the 1960s. 20 to 1 in the 1960s. That ratio today is 320 to 1. At the same time, America's oligarchic wealth. Now, when I say oligarchic wealth, I'm simply talking about huge amounts of wealth in the hands of very, very few people, which translates directly into power. America's oligarchic wealth has reached levels rivaling or exceeding the oligarchic wealth in Russia and China. During the pandemic, America's 745 billionaires increased their wealth by 70%. Let me repeat that. During the pandemic, America's 745 billionaires increased their wealth by 70%. That is, they added in just 1 year, in the year of 2020, the pandemic year of 2020, they added in that 1 year $2.1 trillion to their wealth. A portion of this wealth, this oligarchic wealth, is in turn going into politics. Now, as early as 2012, more than 40% of all money spent in federal elections in the United States came from the top 1% of the 1%, the top 100th of 1%. Let me repeat that again. As early as 2012, more than 40% of all money spent in federal elections came from not the top 1% or even the top 1/10 of 1%, but from the top 100th of 1%. And now some of this wealth is supporting Donald Trump or Trumpism or the attempts by Donald Trump to allege and get widespread acceptance of this lie that Joe Biden lost the election and Donald Trump won it, and that the election was stolen from Joe Biden. A man named Peter Thiel, for example, he's a staunch Trump supporter whose net worth is estimated by Forbes magazine to be $2.16 billion, has now become one of the Republican Party's largest donors. Last year, Mr. Thiel gave $10 million each to the campaigns of two of his proteges, Blake Masters, who's running for the Senate from Arizona, and J.D. Vance, who is running for the Senate from Ohio. Thiel is also backing 12 House of Representatives candidates, 12 candidates for the House, 3 of whom are running primary election challenges to Republicans who voted to impeach Donald Trump for the events of January 6th. Now, it's not just Republicans who are the beneficiaries of this oligarchic wealth. Last year, at least 13 billionaires who had previously donated to Trump lavished campaign donations on Democratic Senators Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema, according to an analysis of Federal Election Commission records. For those of you who have not followed American politics carefully, Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema were the 2 Democrats who refused to go along with Joe Biden's Build Back America plan to slow climate change and to provide other social protections. And they also have refused to modify the filibuster, which means that 60 votes are necessary to get most measures passed through the United States Senate. Now, meanwhile, while all this is going on, this accumulation of oligarchic wealth, this corruption, and I'll use the term advisedly, corruption of American democracy, most Americans are going nowhere. The typical worker's wage in the United States is only a bit higher today than it was 40 years ago when you adjust for inflation. Now, it's true that over the last 8 months, workers' wages have increased in the United States, but inflation has taken away all of those gains. But even before the pandemic, most Americans were working harder than ever, but could not get ahead. And even their children's prospects were not any better. More than 1 out of every 6 American children was, and the current data suggests still is, in poverty. And the typical American family was, and current data suggests, living from paycheck to paycheck. But the biggest casualty of this flattening of wages over the last 40 years, while most of the economic gains have gone to the top, and this oligarchic corruption of democracy, the biggest casualty has been public trust in democracy. A large portion of the American public has become so frustrated and cynical about democracy that they are willing to believe blatant lies of a self-described strongman and willing to support a political party, that is the Republican Party, whose Republican National Committee and most of whose members give every appearance of no longer supporting democracy. In 1964, just 29% of American voters believed, according to a poll that's been done almost every year since then, that government was, quote, run by a few big interests looking out for themselves, unquote. A minority. Most Americans did not believe that. But fast forward to 2013, even before Donald Trump came to the White House, and you find that 79% of Americans believed that government was run by a few big interests looking out for themselves. And you can understand why, given everything that I have suggested so far. Now, a bit of history. For the first 3 decades after the Second World War, democracy did counter the excesses of capitalism in the United States. The United States and war-ravaged Europe, Western Europe, built the largest middle classes the world had ever seen. And arguably the most buoyant democracies. Now, the arrangement was far from perfect. But with the addition of civil rights and voting rights in the United States, subsidized health care, in the United States it came in the form of Medicare and Medicaid, and a vast expansion of public education, democracy was on the way to making capitalism work for the vast majority. And then came a giant U-turn. It came led by Ronald Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in Europe, but the groundwork had already been laid. Deregulation, privatization, globalization, and the unleashing of finance created, well, what can only be described as the full Monty. That is, abandoned factories and abandoned communities, abandoned rural areas, stagnant wages, widening inequality, a shrinking middle class, the form of political corruption in the United States that I've talked about, and shredded social supports. In the 1990s, when I was Secretary of Labor of the United States, I saw firsthand and up close much of this. I saw the shredding of, for example, unemployment insurance. We in the United States, we are fond of saying we have unemployment insurance for anyone who loses a job. Actually, that's not true. Unemployment insurance eligibility is available only to about 28 to 32% of people who lose their jobs. The vast majority of people who lose their jobs are not eligible for standard unemployment insurance. What happened also in the late 70s, early 80s was because of the dominance of finance and the deregulation of finance, the creation of corporate raiders, now more politely known as private equity managers and funders, who were legally able to, because they got some changes in laws and regulations, take over corporations that were, in the language and parlance of the time, quote, underperforming. And as they took over those corporations, cut the number of jobs dramatically, outsourced much of the work, brought in automation and other labor-saving technologies, and abandoned communities. Now, all of this was under the so-called rubric of making these companies perform well, and there were undoubtedly efficiency benefits. But the social costs of all of this were never included and never considered. And it goes on today. So-called underperforming companies, companies whose costs are higher than Wall Street believes is necessary, those companies are sitting ducks for private equity to come in with a lot of debt, very inexpensive debt these days, and buy the company, fire a lot of workers, bust unions, outsource the work, replace workers with automation or increasingly artificial intelligence, abandon communities, and create social costs that are, we now know, huge. Wall Street gains. The economy does become more efficient in this narrow sense of efficiency. Corporate profits increase, but wages stagnate, adjusted for inflation for most people. The median wage stagnates. It has stagnated, adjusted for inflation in the United States for 40 years. And most of the economic gains continue to go to the top. Now, is this inevitable? No, it's not inevitable. In fact, starting last July, the United States did an experiment that might have moved the nation back on track to where it was for the first 3 decades after the Second World War. Starting last July, 36 million American families began receiving pandemic benefits, pandemic payments of up to $3,000 per child, or $3,600 for each child under 6. This was something quite revolutionary. There was no work requirement here. And 36 million American families represented a very large number of American families, not just the poorest of the poor, not just poor, but also working class and some lower middle class families. What were the results of the experiment? Well, child poverty in the United States dropped by at least a third. Some studies suggest more than a third. And the typical American family that had been living from paycheck to paycheck actually got some breathing space. It was, in short, a hugely successful experiment. But it ended abruptly in December when Senator Joe Manchin of West Virginia joined 50 Republican senators in rejecting President Biden's Build Back Better Act, which would have continued this experiment. Why did they do this? Well, they cited concerns over the cost of this experiment, called the refundable child tax credit. Now, the cost, just so you keep this in mind and can compare it to what I'm going to say next, the cost would be an estimated $100 billion a year, or $1.6 trillion over 10 years. But here's the thing. That cost is less then big corporations and the rich will have saved on taxes from the Trump Republican tax cut of 2018. Repeal it, repeal that Trump Republican tax cut, and there would be enough money to finance this refundable child tax credit. The cost of this successful experiment, this refundable child tax credit, is also less than the increase in the wealth of America's 745 billionaires during the pandemic, just during the pandemic. Why not a tax on their wealth? What's wrong with a wealth tax? Well, the short answer is the experiment died because, put simply, America's oligarchy did not want to pay for it. Oligarchic economics, coupled with racist nationalism, marks the ultimate failure of progressive politics. When the people are no longer defended against the powerful, they naturally look elsewhere. As I said at the outset, capitalism is compatible with democracy, but only if democracy is in the driver's seat. But the absence of democracy doesn't strengthen capitalism. Oligarchs may think that it does, but actually, in the end, it fuels despotism. Well, that's 40 minutes. I promised you 40 minutes, and I look forward to your questions.